Okay, here we are. All the science classes are somewhere in the middle of trying to study and learn about these guys, these cells. Um, in almost all of your middle school books, you get this cartoon picture of what a cell is like. And our job is to start to study these organelles, or the parts of a cell that make a cell do what it does and that make a cell work. Now, keep in mind that, again, uh, these cells, if you understand them, and this is why we're really working hard at this, because if you understand these cells, you know a lot, because you learned from the cell theory that every living thing on this earth is made up of cells, including you. So if you start to understand the logic of what these things are doing and the ways they work, um, you really understand a lot of biology. You really understand a lot of life science, and that's our goal today. And I'm going to try to make it real world by putting it in the context of a disease, to just, instead of memorizing a list of organelles with a list of functions that are all mysterious, I just want to make it like a real problem. And diseases are a real problem. So I'm going to try to keep you guys interested by doing that. And the disease I'm going to talk about is diabetes. I am almost certain that almost everybody watching this video has at least heard of that word, diabetes. And I'm also guessing that probably half of you, maybe more, know somebody with diabetes, maybe an aunt or an uncle or a mom or a grandma, grandpa. Um, so we'll learn a little bit about diabetes too in this, but the real goal is to learn kind of how cells are working and what these organelles are doing. Okay? I don't like these kind of cartoon pictures that you see in all the books, because they don't give you guys an appreciation. I mean, these guys, these cells, they're you, they're us, they're every living thing on earth. And when you see something like this in a book, it's kind of like, I don't know, just like not that interesting. Because if these things are you, and I'm trying to tell you that you're made up of cells, and you look at this, it's not that impressive. But the reality of what this thing, I mean, I get it. They're trying to give you a simplified picture because there's a lot of information for you guys to learn at this stage. So they make a simplified cartoon. But that's nice for teaching purposes. But what's not nice about it is it doesn't let you guys appreciate the complexity of you. I mean, this picture here is an actual cell picture that was kind of reconstructed with an actual super powerful microscope. And this box here would just represent a tiny section, like it would represent this little piece of this little diagram. And if you really looked inside with a super powerful microscope, you'd actually see something like this. Just in this little section, and the whole entire cell is just filled with stuff like this, with parts and pieces. And that's you. You have 50 trillion of these guys of all different types working together to make you and to do the things that cells do. It's amazing, actually. Here's a blow up of that. So again, all these different things, a lot of these are the organelles and the parts and pieces we're going to talk about in this little lecture. All right. So I told you I would put this into the context of diabetes. So what is diabetes? Let's ask Dr. Smarty. So in your blood, again, this is a simplified cartoon. Blood's really complicated. But if this is inside a blood vessel, okay, let's say near your heart, they're showing just two things, but blood has a lot of things in it. They're showing you red blood cells. They carry oxygen, and the blood gets that oxygen out to all your body's cells. Um, and then these little blue things here are supposed to represent sugar. And that's all they're showing you. They're showing you the blood cells because we're telling you that this is a condition or a disease that takes place in the blood. And they're showing you sugar because diabetes is a problem where in the blood you've got too much sugar. You can see it right here. There's too much sugar in the blood. The scientific word for that is hyperglycemia. Hyper means too much or high. Glyce means sugar, and emia means in the blood. So literally, high sugar blood, Hyperglycemia is high blood sugar. That's the problem in diabetes. And when the sugar gets too high in the blood, that's a very bad thing for reasons that get a little bit more complicated. And if you want to learn about that, just ask. So normally what happens when the sugar is high in the blood, it's usually not, because all the other cells in your body need the sugar and they're constantly drinking up the glucose. So this glucose finds its way out of the blood into cells. So and the cells are using the sugar for energy. That's fantastic. That keeps the blood sugar low. But for this glucose or sugar to get in, it it needs to kind of be let in. And there's a hormone called insulin. This insulin, when it sticks to a cell membrane, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, with cell membranes, but when this hormone sticks to a cell membrane, it opens up a door in the membrane, or it opens up a path for the sugar to get into the cell. And that's great, because when the sugar gets into the cell, it's moving out of the blood. And that's great for a diabetic. All right? So the sugar sticks to the membrane, the glucose can get in, and that's shown over here. Glucose is going in only when the insulin is sticking to the cell membrane. They say here, insulin is the key that unlocks the glucose channel. The glucose channel would be this green thing letting the glucose into the cell. Maybe I'm going to pose a really big question for you guys, because you guys are smart and we're making this real world. If you do know somebody who's diabetic and their blood sugar is high because for some reason they're not able to get the glucose in by this process, you should ask yourself, and maybe you can even rewind the video to how this was all working again, but you should ask yourself what might be wrong in a diabetic that for whatever reason the blood sugar stays high. The glucose is not able to find its way into cells. There could be a few things wrong that make a diabetic. But think about that. All right, so back to our cartoon cell to make this simple. Oh, I should say, when I was showing you this real cell, what a real cell is like, all of this stuff, these organelles and all these things, all these machines running around and moving and doing things, they are all built up of proteins. A cell works because it's a giant factory of proteins, and the organelles are also giant factories of proteins that do things. So proteins are just molecules in your cell, and they get put together to do pretty much everything. So back to our cartoon. So I'm going to start out with this organelle called the nucleus. I think a lot of you might know, or if you don't, you're going to know it now, that the DNA is inside the nucleus. And the DNA is called the master molecule, or the blueprint. And it's guarded inside this nucleus. And it's the master molecule because all the proteins that make up this cell are made with instructions that are in the DNA. You see, the DNA is made up of genes, and the genes have a code in them, and the code is telling the cell exactly which proteins to make so that the cell can make everything it needs. The cell needs to make all the proteins that it needs. The instructions for doing that are in the DNA. The proteins are actually made on these ribosomes right here. So the DNA codes or has the instructions to make a protein. It's in the nucleus. The protein is made in the ribosomes. That's out here in the cytoplasm, which is outside of the nucleus. So the cytoplasm is the stuff outside of the nucleus. We got a problem. If the DNA has the code or the instructions to make a protein, and in this case, for our diabetic person, the protein we want to make is insulin so that they can get their glucose, their sugar in the cells. So there's a gene for insulin here in the nucleus. But the insulin protein is going to get made on ribosomes, and that's a problem. So the DNA makes a messenger molecule, and it sends it through these little holes in the nucleus out. So there's a messenger molecule that has to get out. The DNA has a gene for insulin, it makes a message for insulin, and that message finds a ribosome. The ribosomes are these tiny little dots that you see in the cell, these tiny little dots, not these tubes, but the dots. So the messenger goes out, and it's a message that's going to tell the ribosomes to make insulin. And the ribosomes will make proteins, so it's going to make the insulin. And it puts the protein in these tubes. And these tubes that you're seeing here, those are the endoplasmic reticulum. So the protein ends up in those tubes. And the endoplasmic reticulum, inside those tubes, the protein gets put together and it gets folded properly so that it can do its job the right way. And it moves to the places where it needs to go. So the endoplasmic reticulum are involved with like getting the protein all set correctly and set up right so that it has the right shape to do its job. And it transports it to to the region of the cell where it needs to go next. For insulin, eventually insulin is going to want to get out of the cell because it needs to get out into the blood so that it can find all the other cells, so that it can get out into the blood, so that it can find all its other cells, so that it can sit here and open up the gate to let the glucose in. Okay? So, right now the insulin is trapped in the endoplasmic reticulum tubes. So what happens after that is the endoplasmic reticulum sends the insulin protein to this guy here. This is the Golgi body. And it's also a bunch of tubes, but what you can see here is that little things pinching off, like little vesicles pinching off. These little things that are coming off the Golgi are called vesicles. And guess, in our story here, guess what's going to be inside these vesicles? These guys are going to be packed with insulin. And the Golgi packages the proteins that it wants to inside vesicles, and also is involved in shipping them where they need to go. So in this case, the vesicle is going to need to go out to the cell membrane so that it can spit out its insulin inside. All right. So the path, again, just to review, is there's a gene in the nucleus for insulin. It makes a message, and the message finds a ribosome, and they work together to make the protein. So the message with the ribosome make the protein. The insulin got made, and it's put in the ER, and it's folding up and moving toward the Golgi, because the Golgi is going to need to put it into a vesicle to get it out. Okay? All of this stuff, just like in the real world, when things are moving around and when you're having to move things and make these proteins, all that requires energy. So these guys here, and here's another one, are called mitochondria. And they are providing all the energy for all the processes that are going on inside the cell. Every process that's going on inside a cell pretty much requires energy. And these guys are making a molecule called ATP. And in that molecule is stored up energy that the cell uses to do all the stuff I've been talking about. Because as you're learning, and you saw in that crazy picture, that there's all sorts of parts and pieces and proteins that make up these machines inside cells, just like in the real world, these machines break down, they get old, and they need to be taken apart and recycled. So these guys here, these lysosomes, these kind of structures here, are involved in recycling damaged parts and breaking them up into the parts that can be reused to make more DNA or cell membranes or mitochondria. So all the proteins and machines kind of get continually recycled by lysosomes so that you can keep making and repairing the older parts of the cell that are kind of getting damaged through wear and tear. The cell membrane we talked about, we saw that in the diabetes cell because the glucose wasn't able to get through. The glucose needed little things, needed like these things inside the cell membrane called receptors. So cell membrane really does not let anything through. It keeps everything inside the cell inside, everything outside the cell outside, and it only lets in and out what it wants to. And it does that by having these receptors that allow the things to come in or go out as needed. So these receptors are the way in or out of a cell. They cannot get through the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is protective and it's involved in homeostasis and keeping everything just right inside the cell. You don't want everything just moving in and out without controlling it perfectly. So the cell membrane is involved with homeostasis, keeping the inside just right and not letting everything just come in or out. Receptors are inside, are in the cell membranes. They are the ones who are allowing things in or out as needed. So I think this is everything I wanted you guys to know about the organelles for now. I think we've covered them all. Oh, I didn't talk about cytoskeleton. Cytoskeleton is just a bunch of like kind of like stiff or rigid, like two by fours or proteins that are kind of built up and kind of provide structure and support inside the cell for all the protein machines to kind of do their job. So cytoskeleton provides like a lot of the rigid support and structure inside the cell. The cytoplasm is everything else inside the cell. But you saw in that picture, in the actual picture, that there's not much room for just plain old cytoplasm. Pretty much everything is organelles and vesicles and vacuoles and mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum. Again, this cartoon isn't such a great representation. So I'm going to end it here. You may need to watch this a couple times. I've talked about every one of these organelles and what it's doing. And I tried to do it in the context of diabetes. If this cell worked properly and it in this Golgi body made a vesicle with insulin and it sent that insulin out of the cell, out, and it sent this vesicle out of the cell so that now that insulin is out there in your body to let the glucose in. I want you to go back to the original question of what are the kind of things that might be going wrong in a diabetic patient that cannot let the glucose in. It's a complicated thing. You may need to watch this a couple times to start getting some really good ideas about that. But give it a shot, and thank you guys for watching.